following segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Seattle City Councilwoman Kshama Sawant is not running for her seat again, and that means that this is her final year on the Seattle City Council. What a blessing. What a hashtag blessing. But one of my concerns about her leaving is what she would try to push through before she leaves. You know, Kshama Sawant is the longest serving member right now on the Seattle City Council. She has really formed this intense following of activists in the city who will show up to council meetings in person in the middle of the day, who will testify on behalf of her policies. And I think it gives a false impression for the Seattle City Council that more people support her policies than actually do, because those are the people who show up in the middle of the day and who are able to dedicate time to do this. So I was happy yesterday to see that Kshama Sawant's latest effort to make it more difficult to be a landlord in the city of Seattle failed. It's important to know rent control is not allowed under state law right now. So this would be sort of a vote from the council to say, hey, we want this, and to put pressure on Democrats in Olympia to make it possible. So Kshama Sawant put this forth. It ended up failing, but the vote didn't happen until a lot of Kshama Sawant supporters had their 1 minute of fame or whatever it was to speak during public testimony. And I'm going to play a couple different types of testimony for you. First, I'm going to play some of the activists who showed up in favor of rent control. And then I want to play some comments from a small landlord, because you're going to see sort of the dichotomy here of people who were for this policy and people who were against it. But let's start with the pro-rent control activists.
Hi there, my name is Kat. I'm a student, and as someone who has to pay rent every month, I've got a few questions for everybody here today. Why is it so difficult to pass a bill that would protect the working class members of our population, who you claim to stand for? Why do you stand idly by as those who have plenty continue to extort at those who have so little?
Voting no on this legislation is siding with corporate greedy landlords and against working people.
They're happy to sell out working people, low-income people, poor families, especially those who are Black, brown, Indigenous, queer. What do we want?
Rent control!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Rent control!
When do we want it?
Now!
Councilmember Juarez, if you're tired of listening to us, just vote yes.
That's right.
And you don't even have the spine to stand up to these corporate landlords. Shame on you.
And it sounds like every landlord who spoke probably paints over mold. All of the costs to even get an apartment are so ridiculous. First, last, and then a deposit. Landlords are even scamming people and charging people $300 for an application fee, and then and people don't even get the place. This is just so ridiculous. It is absurd. And if you can't do your civic duty, you shouldn't have this job. Pick a different job. I give up the rest of my time.
Well, your time was over, so that's very generous of you. But when I listen to that, comments about, I have to put a deposit down to rent this place. Like, how dare you? How dare you have any sort of requirements for me to be able to live in your apartment or me to be able to live in the home that you're renting out? And it really comes across as this sort of hissy fit where they're screaming at the council members, chanting in council chambers. And, part of the whole characterization of, every landlord is bad. Every landlord is this big conglomerate that is only out there to make us suffer and to cost us a roof over our head. It's absurd. And there are plenty of small landlords in Seattle who, over the past 3 years in particular, have tried to speak out for themselves. During some of the policies during the pandemic that made it very, very difficult for small landlords to make a living because people didn't have to pay rent. They didn't even have to prove that they had some sort of financial strain that would lead to them needing to have a break on rent. And the difficulty in trying to evict people who, by any reasonable standard, need to be evicted. And so for small landlords to be painted with this broad brush and lumped in with major corporations and bad landlords is just absurd. And I want to give you a good example of that. So these activists are speaking and they're vilifying landlords. And there is a woman who again, she comes forth and she's very reasonable. She's very practical. She's just trying to share her experience being a small landlord in Seattle. So I want you to listen to her story. I want you to listen to the reasonable way that she tries to share her story with the council. And then I want you to listen to the way activists reacted to her testimony at the end.
My name is Jennifer Leakish. I'm a past renter, current landlord, and a regular hardworking person. I own rental properties in Districts 3 and 7. Do the right thing and vote against rent control. This bill wants to peg rental increases to a cost of living increase of roughly 3%. But rental costs are pegged to the cost of expenses and not the cost of living. My property taxes increased by 21% last year, and backflow testing went from $55 to $70, which is a 27% increase. These are city-imposed fees. The problem is rising costs, which should be addressed. This bill also prevents property owners from reducing rental units in their properties. For example, if I rent a mother-in-law apartment in my house, then I have to rent the apartment indefinitely, which is a problem as I may want to have my single-family home without the apartment as my family grows or I have a lifestyle change. This bill is a bad idea. Please do not vote for it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Leo.
So let that sink in for a moment. So here you have activists who show up, as they always do, and bogart public testimony. They do it and they're vicious and they yell at council members and they demand to get their way. They say, if you're sick of listening to us, just vote how we want you to vote. And then you have a couple small landlords sprinkled in, like this woman who says, I don't disagree that the cost of rent is high, but there's other costs associated with that. She said, I used to be a renter. I'm just a small time landlord who's renting out this unit in my home. And this is going to make it very difficult for me. And what happens? She gets booed. She shows up, takes time to share her story as a small landlord, is very reasonable and rational in the way that she does it, doesn't scream at the council members like the activist does, doesn't demand that they do exactly what she says that she wants them to do, and then she gets booed at the end. And that has been so indicative of essentially every debate that's been led by Councilwoman Kshama Sawant. That's how it goes. It's like children versus adults. And, in listening to that woman's story, I was also reminded, this whole subject of vilifying every single landlord in the city and lumping them in with big bad landlords. Our friend Jason Rands over at KTTH, he did a story the other day on this guy who says he's essentially lost his home that he bought in 2016. He's a machinist by trade, ends up buying this home in South Seattle in 2016, renting it out to a guy who never even made the first month's payment, tries to work with him on it, and then finds out that this guy who's never made a payment for rent is renting out his home on Airbnb. He's not even paying rent. Claims he's low income so the city won't shut off the utilities as a way to try to get the guy out. And he's making money off this guy's home by renting it out on Airbnb, and the city won't do anything. That's the kind of stuff that landlords in Seattle are faced with. That is unreasonable. That is ridiculous. And the fact that you have people like Kshama Sawant and this, what I think is truly a small vocal group of activists who show up and make it seem like so many more people support rent control than actually do, and they want to vilify everyone, is just absurd. I'm very much looking forward to hopefully getting past that place as a city once Kshama Sawant leaves office. But here's what the message I want people to hear on this. So during all this testimony, you heard these activists who, again, are basically just doing what Kshama Sawant wants them to do. You heard them use this vote as a way to vilify Democrats, liberal Democrats, pro-labor Democrats, even the most progressive Democrats, like Teresa Mosqueda, who is an uber progressive on the Seattle City Council. She had to recuse herself from this vote because she had a scheduling conflict. They even attacked her for not being there.
Councilmember Mosqueda calls herself a progressive and a labor Democrat, and yet she could not bother to show up for a vote that is of so much consequence to working class people and poor people. Yeah, scheduling conflicts happen, but come on, all you needed to do was show up in Zoom for a few minutes for the vote. That's right. Mosqueda led the way in repealing the pandemic hazard pay for grocery workers, but she didn't even bother to show up to vote on our rent control law. Why should union members and working people support Mosqueda's election campaign if she won't speak in support of this bill and doesn't bother to show up to vote yes? And that goes for all of the council members that want to call themselves progressive or labor Democrats. Lewis, Herbold, Morales, we're watching your vote.
You sit here and twiddle your thumbs hiding behind a state ban when you know that this will put pressure on the state Democrats to lift the ban.
I don't see why this is so difficult for all of the Democrats who claim to be here for labor, yet obviously are here for those who are oppressing the rest of us.
These are families with parents working full-time jobs who cannot put a roof over their children's heads. And it is because of corporate greed being allowed to run this city and the lack of response from Democrats here on City Council and at the state level.
If City Council Democrats vote no on Councilmember Sawant's strong rent control legislation, they will have made it clear that the Democratic Party is on the side of greedy multimillionaires and billionaire real estate barons.
If Council Democrats vote no on Sawant's strong rent control, they have made it clear that they are on the side of greedy landlords who are allegedly price fixing and not on the side of working families trying to keep a roof over their heads.
Yeah. So if you are not with us 100% of the time, you are against us. You are, in the words of Kshama Sawant, just as bad as Republicans. And that messaging, and you heard even in those individual clips of testimony that some of it sounded exactly the same because they're just basically reading off a script that Kshama Sawant gives them. Here's a little bit of a clip of Kshama Sawant, talking about that same theme about Democrats on the council.
If I was giving a grade to the Democratic Party for standing up for working people and the poor, what grade would we give them? Enough. Absolutely.
Enough. Here's the thing, and here is the takeaway message from all of this. For reasonable Democrats in the city of Seattle, liberal Democrats, progressive Democrats, you are never going to be enough for that group of activists. You are never going to do enough for them. You can be as progressive as you want to be. I mean, they even vilified Teresa Mosqueda, suggesting, well, why would we support her when she didn't show up for us on this one issue? Kowtowing to the fringe activists that for so long in Seattle have had this outsized voice at City Hall is a fruitless endeavor. The second you step out of line, they vilify you, they attack you, they scream at you. You are never going to be enough for them. If that's not an indication that you should stop trying to ingratiate yourselves to the farthest left fringe of Seattle, I don't know what else is. Instead of hopelessly, time and time again, trying to do what these activists want you to do, who are never going to like you anyway, who are never going to support you anyway, why not try catering to people in the middle, to reasonable people like that landlord who spoke and said, look, I used to be a renter. I'm a small landlord. I'm just trying to get by. Why not cater to them? Why not cater to the people who don't show up at council chambers and scream at you and demand that you do exactly what they tell you to do? Catering to the fringe in Seattle has done nothing for you. So it's time to try a different approach. That segment was brought to you by our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action today at future42.org.